right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this week's Monday Morning Human Intelligence. So 30 minutes to shake up your mind and get your week started off right. So I'm thrilled to have all of you joining us today, and I'm thrilled to have Molly with us as well. So many of you are familiar with Molly, but we'll get to her introduction and conversation coming up soon. But we have lots of new people that are joining us this time. So know that the chat is open. So feel free to post questions or links to things that come up in the chat. If you would like to be a part of our Slack community for next time, then just send me a request. We'll make sure that you get added to that, and we'll continue the thread in Slack so that we can have a discussion that's a little bit more robust. So I'm Dan Manning. I'm the founder of Human Intelligence. So we teach teams how to think more critically, more creatively, how to collaborate better, and how to communicate better to solve tough problems. And I'm joined by my co-host, Rebecca DeButt. So Rebecca, thanks for being here. And can you give us a quick introduction about Molly before we get into the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. And since there's some new folks, I just want to let you guys know you can ping me separately if you have any tech issues. I can hopefully help you out. So thanks to Molly Cain for being here today. Molly is a disruptor and an innovator, and she has background in both public and private sector. And she is the founder of GovCity. So that's the nation's fastest growing collective cross-industry of innovators. So very, very excited to have Molly as our guest speaker today. And thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Great, thanks, Molly. So today we're going to talk about the irrational humanity of disruption. So it's really a discussion about why disruptors disrupt. Why do you do the things that you do? And doing the research for this discussion, one of the topics that I came across was about a story from actually the mid-1800s in Hungary, where there were lots of women after childbirth were dying of what we now know to be a staph infection, and no one, the rates of death were actually really high, maybe up to about 18% of the women who came in for childbirth were dying from this infection, until one day, one doctor, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, discovered that if he simply washed his hands after operating on infected cadavers before going and working on his live patients, he could dramatically reduce the rate of infection. And in fact, he was one of the first people to use statistics to sort of show that this works. So he came up with a pretty common sense way of keeping people alive, but the problem was that nobody listened to him, right? That his colleagues refused to believe that doctors, as gentlemanly as themselves, could actually be carriers of this type of infection. So he was never able to convince his colleagues to adopt this pretty common sense, simple measure that would save lives. He eventually was forced out of his job. He moved back to Hungary. He moved into another clinic there. He's able to reproduce the same results and dramatically decrease the rate of infection, but still no one listened to him. He wrote, and a few people would acknowledge his writings, but for the most part, they stuck to their beliefs about balancing humors and bloodletting and how that was actually the real cause of infection. And then eventually he turns to alcohol. He withdraws from his family and dies alone in an insane asylum. So fortunately, most of our stories of innovation don't end with such a tragic ending, but I do think that we recognize that the road to innovation is fraught with peril. So how about this? Let's end the polling, and here's what I'll ask you to do, is just hold up your fingers. How many out of every 10 ideas that you have are successful? I'm probably gonna say 2. Yeah, okay. So it looks like some of the best among us maybe have a 40% success rate. Everybody else has maybe a 10 or 20% success rate. So Molly, here's my question to you. So knowing that most ideas are likely to not be successful, and knowing that the path between the way that we've always done things and the way that we could be doing things is twisted and fraught with peril, why? Why do you do it? Why do you keep leading for innovation, and why do innovators keep innovating?
Okay, so we talked about it the other day, and the closest I can get to explaining it is about similar to an addiction of wanting to jump out of good airplanes and climb mountains and do dangerous things, that once you have cracked the code and been able to solve one really big problem that inside your gut you felt was the right route, it becomes really addicting. And it becomes, when you can see the results of it, it far outweighs any of the any of the missteps, any of the failures, any of the doors that didn't open, it just becomes a favorite thing to do. And I had the good or terrible fortune of encountering my first disruptive moment, probably a year and a half out of college. So 2004, 2005 timeframe, and ran into my most logical first problem, and it made no sense that people weren't wanting to pursue it. So I just did it myself and watched it pay off for my client that I was doing it for. So ever since then, I care a lot about the frustrations that come with it, and it is exhausting and sometimes really heartbreaking, but I care more about the chance that it might work.
Yeah, in fact, your experience is also backed by science, right? So psychologists, when they look at creativity and creative people, they actually find this interesting connection between sort of the creative person's personality and essentially an addiction to dopamine, right? That the same dopamine that gives you that feeling of pleasure and that gives you the payoff at the end of that innovation is also the chemical that helps to sort of lower your inhibitions. And it's those lowered inhibitions that psychologists say helps us or helps creative people to be more creative, because now they're able to allow multiple ideas in their brain at one time and let those collide. But it's also the chemical that leads us to sometimes some antisocial behavior, right? It's also when you lower those inhibitions and you're able to think better, it also lowers your inhibitions when you're talking to other people about your ideas. So I'm curious how you advise folks that you work with to be a disruptor and be disruptive, but still have healthy relationships with the people that you have to work with.
I don't know if I'm a really good expert on having a ton of healthy relationships, so there's that caveat. But I started cussing a lot more when I started playing golf and started disrupting. So that like hand in hand. But I will say that once you've learned, and we talked about this the other day, once you've learned that your boundaries can stretch with what you've discovered of your own skill sets and what you've discovered of the capability of an organization, regardless of industry, you don't want to go back and you don't want to contract that again. So I'm more willing to sit at a table and say, is nobody else going to tell them that the emperor is naked right now? I'm super willing to be the only person saying that, because usually there's somebody else that's like, yeah, you're right, this is a really stupid idea. And then give others the confidence, because I've seen it happen. I'd say the first 5 years of my career, I felt like I was very broken until I ran into a boss that found a way to utilize me. So to the relationships part, I make sure I intentionally only work with people who can utilize my skill. Because if I am constantly butting with folks on a leadership level, it's nightmare, complete nightmare.
Yeah, so there's some other research that looked at the relationship that disruptors have with their coworkers. And it's probably no surprise to you that the more, like the higher the level of innovative behavior an individual displays, the lower they rate their relationship with coworkers, right? And this is even a bigger, the effect is magnified the more a person makes their personal identity the same as their job identity. And that's something that a lot of folks in this audience do, where they identify themselves with their job in a very, very tight manner. So now that when you have those conflicts, they're no longer conflicts over ideas, they're conflicts over values and your own personal worth. And the same conflict that you as the innovator are feeling is mirrored in your coworkers, who are now scared because of the uncertainty that you're creating around them.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. There's been groups that they know what I can bring to the table, but then when they experience it firsthand, it's really uncomfortable. So some folks in the department are completely into it because they've asked for that, and then others don't really know that when I say on LinkedIn, like, we should be questioning archaic, old, bad process, that I actually do that in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are obsessed with your ugly baby, I probably will insult it. And so
Right.
it definitely charges relationships, and you can see, and there's a large part of that of why I created Gulf City, because it does send out a bat signal to others who think and feel and are lone wolves a lot of the time. It can be a lonely job, and you'll have a handful, maybe 1 to 5 other people on your team, depending on the size, that will lean in and want to learn it or participate. But largely, people like me, and I know there's a lot of folks on the call that feel the same way. We're often brought in as like the token disruptor, and it's great in theory, but it is really uncomfortable in practice.
Yeah, right. So part of the irrationality, as I was thinking about it over the weekend, isn't just the irrationality of the disruptor, right? The person who looks and says, this is likely to fail and it's going to be a tough road and it'd be easier if I just kept doing what we always do. But I think we also, particularly in bureaucracies, find some irrationality on the inside as well. So typically when we think about innovation and we say that we want more innovative behavior, there's a rational calculation, right? There's a rational calculation that we want to do things better. We want to find better processes. We want to find cheaper ways of doing business. And that's sort of that one level of innovation that's pretty difficult to argue with. And that's where we focus most of our attention, trying to create ideas. But the reality is we can create ideas pretty well. It's that second level of innovation that's more at the social political level, where you have to get that piece of innovation past all these people who are going to be resistant to it, and where you have these deeply ingrained biases that that will, in fact, serve to make your idea derail. So, and I think that's particularly um, an important factor inside bureaucracies. Is that what you've found yourself working inside the government and outside the government? Do you see how those compare?
Yeah, and I'll say that, and hopefully I'm answering this by going in kind of a unique direction with it, but I run into bureaucratic problems when somebody wants a visual innovation
Hmm.
situation, but doesn't they don't want to actually truly implement it because they don't understand and they're not listening to it. Um, it's worse when they think that innovation is just ideas, because a lot of times that's usually all they're hearing from people like me. That's because of what your survey question was. Every 10 ideas, one works. So the way I often describe my job is I walk in and there's books everywhere and I'm just pressing the spines of these books to see what hallway opens up. That's why you hear hundreds of ideas from me, because I don't know what's going to land based on that culture. And so and where that one book opened up today, it might not tomorrow, and I got to go to this book. So there's always a handful of ideas that are being worked all the time. But where it becomes a really big issue, and where I definitely will sometimes sacrifice relationships because this infuriates me, and I'm still working on adulting, but
Aren't we all?
it's take a couple years. Um, but where it really becomes quite frustrating is when people take the tip of the iceberg of a really great idea that has an infinite play ages down the line, and they'll take it, and in bureaucratic organizations it's frustrating for everybody regardless of who you are, whether, and I apologize for the noise, but
Hmm.
whether you love old school process or want to change the entire world, bureaucracy is frustrating. And so sometimes a really good idea is the only win, but then they don't realize how they're actually hurting something huge if we all work together. So that's been one of my most frustrating elements.
So we had a good question from Nick Swain asking about, so how do you get those client leaders on board? What has been your experience in trying to convince leaders to really innovate rather than just looking like they're innovating?
I will tell you that the Comerica Bank was probably, and that was 2010 to 2013 for me. It was 3.5 years of work. And the only way I got the executives to truly, truly listen to me, and I was overseeing all of internal communications as vice president for over 300 banking centers. And you think it would be, they would maybe listen. Maybe I thought so. The only way I got them to listen was to start a Forbes column so that they actually realized that I had outside voice,
Right.
and then they would listen to some of my ideas on the inside. So I had to hack my own credibility to be able to be heard there. And only until then, when I was a very public voice, did the executives inside think, oh, maybe she knows what she's talking about. But nothing changed. It was
Right.
just a different voice spot. So at Homeland Security and all the other places, I try really hard to hire and support bosses, whether I work for them directly or not. I find a boss or a leader that can appreciate what I can bring to the table, because as much as we all think that we can be leaders at any level, you've got to have cover. You can't do what we do and not have cover.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're going right back to that cover being not just bureaucratic cover, but also that personal relationship, that trust that you're working towards something that's good. And Ron, I really appreciate this question from him. He says sometimes disruptive ideas are just bad ideas, right? Sometimes every idea that people come up with just turns out not to be so good. So how do you sort of filter those ideas and maintain relationships with other disruptors, and help them to maybe turn their bad idea into something better, or just tell them that baby's not gonna win any pageants?
I think a bad idea completely depends on where you're sitting. It's like, and we talked about this too, Dan, the other day. Like, the idea is, I don't sit around an office and look for a problem to,
Mm-hmm.
like, as much as it probably appears that way. They call out to me. I'll be in a meeting and I'll be like, oh my dear God, I gotta care about that. Some of them are the
Right.
least problems ever, but they just get me. And so I don't pursue anything that doesn't seem logical to me. But I have grown in a lot of awareness of, like, what I find logical that can be fixed, 5 of you guys will think is ridiculous. So it
Mm-hmm.
totally depends on where you're sitting, and then ultimately how far into the future you can see, which there's no fault of anybody if you can't see that far. But that's why I love having touched a ton of different industries, because I can see very differently on a cross industry level. It doesn't make me better than anybody else. It just makes me more acceptable, or I can accept a lot more weird and a lot more different.
Right. And you come from a background that itself is fairly varied as well. So you have lots of raw material to start connecting and making ideas from, and that's really the root of creativity. And so Donna asked an interesting question, and it's one that we sort of developed an impromptu metaphor for when we had our previous conversation about really the how do you help other people to decide that they're going to be creative as well, and how do you build that sort of that ecosystem and that confidence inside folks so that after you're gone, those ideas continue?
So that's been a really interesting adventure. Usually it's the bravery that I use to run one of my own ideas forward that will activate somebody in realizing that they could do it themselves. There's a lot of that involved with GovCity, but I've found like that skill set exists in a lot of people, especially in the government space. There's just
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of culture that allows for it. And so when I rolled in for Homeland Security specifically, um, I wasn't presenting any kind of new opinion. I was just presenting a different kind of insanity and more willing to go after it. And when I am the Braveheart, like running through the field, they're a lot more comfortable running behind me and going with me. And so um, if that activates an expansion of their borders and their boundaries, then when I leave, they've already tasted what it's like to run forward on an idea. So I feel like I've left it better than I found it if I can encourage somebody else to just lean into what they already know is wrong. It's not
Right.
really a new skill, it's just an activated one.
Yeah. So I think it's related to sort of what we talked about before, where you're sitting in this meeting and you hear this thing that is ridiculous, right? And you have this. It's not even an epiphany, right? It's just obvious that the way that we're approaching this is not the right way. And we sort of
Yeah.
talked about how it's almost as if there's this big stadium full of people that are just happy, watching this game, and that it's just this thing that happens, and this is what we do. We show up, we watch people do things, and then at the end of the day, we'll go home and we'll do that, and then we'll come back here next week and we'll watch another game. And meanwhile, you said you are essentially out in this stream where you can see the stadium, you can hear the cheers, but you would go nuts if you were forced to sit in those bleachers and eat bad nachos for a couple of hours. So how do you encourage people to sort of join you in that stream and know that it's okay to leave the stadium? Like it's not that good all the time.
Yeah, it definitely, I have a lot of respect for people who don't want to spend every waking moment fixing stuff. I get it. And that's not it. I would probably exhaust myself to death if I was doing the same. So I pick my battles, and there's certain days where I'll hang out in the stadium with everybody else, and I'll wear the right outfit, and I'll cheer the right people and pick a team and do all the things. But then if it is a problem that I really care about, I will willingly jump into the stream on my paddleboard and go whatever direction I want. And I love, and I did create Gov City to find others that wanted to do that as well. And we found a really unique way to recruit that or scout that. It's not, like I said, it's not a talent that you can really teach. It's already in anybody that's curious about it. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but it is really, you just have to be comfortable not sitting in the stadium, and that takes a different kind of mindset completely. Yeah.
No, yeah, I really appreciate what you say. And I say that we teach creativity, but if I can be honest with the folks that are on this call, I mean, really what we do is we unlock creativity. We give people the permission to be creative again. And then as soon as they start rebuilding that creative confidence, now they can't stop themselves from being creative. And Dylan has an interesting question there as well, which I think is sort of part of my experience has been that I have to realize that all of my ideas are not going to be good. That initial feeling that I get about the idea is probably fairly similar, and just the personality types of people that are disruptive tend to be the term that they use in the literature is a hypomanic personality, where you're very outgoing, you're very busy, maybe you work on very little sleep, you've got lots of projects that you're juggling all at the same time. It's sort of just this side of bipolar disorder, but it also sort of has this pendulum that swings back to this place where you have those inner voices that say, this is a wreck. Like, what am I doing? I should go back to the stadium and have a seat. Everything's going to be fine there. And I think for me, I really had to focus on how to sort of hold those two ideas at the same time and know that I'll survive, right? These two things will work. And maybe I can do a little bit of prototype or a little bit of testing to see if what I believe is a good idea is really going to work. So in your own mind, sort of how do you balance those two competing drives?
Yeah, I couldn't even count how many ideas I care about right this second. I could not even possibly calculate that.
Mm-hmm.
But I can count how many, if you think of it on, I don't know, a racetrack scale, there are certain ones that are all the way up here. There are others that are back this way. And so it totally depends on the environment, the people that I'm working with, the timing. There's some spectacular ideas that we had for Gulf City that needed to be put in a mason jar and hidden on a shelf in March. There's just no way. But we'll take them down when that time is right. And so you can be baking, I call it my brain plate. You can be baking on that plate all the time. But it totally, you've got to read the room. Sometimes I read it horribly, but other times, if I take an idea all the way over here, I know for sure that an extra push beyond my normal boundaries will get it to done. There are probably less than a dozen times that I've taken an idea where I'm like, this is a hill that I'm going to die on, maybe, potentially. There's not that many. Right. I act like every single one of them is that, but that's only because you've got to kick the tire enough to know if it's worth moving. And if it doesn't move anywhere, then you just don't pursue it, at least right then.
Yeah, so it's re-injecting rationality into your own your own mental health and your own energy levels, right? Here's what I think will work, or here's the estimate of how much energy it's going to take to turn this into something. Is the outcome going to be worth that energy level? So
And
we've
I've
got
got like
please go ahead.
this. Oh yeah,
Yes.
I've got that calendar, I've got this, and I've got this, and they all have different kinds of ideas. So I know time of day, different topic, where I am. My phone has a ton of notes. So if I'm jogging, I've got a bunch of like ideas that I've got to call a crazy friend to work on. But there's certain books that those are projects being worked on. Beyond that, everything is an idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. 100%. So we've got just under 4 minutes left now. So what I would like to encourage folks to do is, if you want to connect with other like-minded people, other people that are sort of in the innovation thinking space, post your LinkedIn profile there in the chat, and then we can save those and people can make those connections after this session is over. And Molly, I'd like to ask you, I mean, this is what GovCity is all about, right? It's connecting and finding other people that are outside the stadium to sort of build resilience and build a community. So how have you seen the importance of those relationships, even outside of the place that you're innovating, just with other innovators?
God, it solved a major problem for me, which I think selfishly is why I launched it in the first place. I felt so alone at Homeland Security, and then I started poking around and realized that there were a lot of people like me. I just didn't have an outlet to connect with them. So GovCity, like the first GovCity, was so cathartic for me that each iteration of it, we're able to embrace a different level of innovator. And I thought it might be important. I know there's quite a few people here that have specialized or taken the Think Wrong course. It's really important to identify your role in innovation and understanding you don't have to be a crazy disruptor to be important to innovation. Like if you're a shepherd, if you're the sheriff or what have you, if you can take that football down the line in some way, you're a huge value add, and you don't have to be like me to add value. And most of the time you'll add more value if you're not a me. So there is that. But everybody has a different role. And so GovCity is helping to identify who and where everybody fits if we can help.
Awesome. So in our last 2 minutes, I'm curious about sort of your own innovation or creativity in your personal life, things that are completely unrelated to making other people's lives better. Like for me, it's cooking. Last night we had a piece of sea bass that I made in just a recipe that I was making up at the time, but that's sort of my own personal creativity outlet. What about you? What do you do that's creative for yourself?
I write a lot. I snuggle with greyhounds even more than that. I'm training for a marathon, and I'm learning Buddhism so I can be calmer about everything that freaks me out. So I'm trying, and meditation and Buddhism are really interesting to me because we tend, especially in my world and my roles that I take on, having perspective and understanding why pushback is occurring is super important to me. And so, in the Buddhist theory that everything looking at you is a reflection. So what am I putting out that I'm getting that back? And that's been very important lately.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I know most of the personalities of folks that are on the line tend to be very driven. So I can imagine this impulse to, I'm going to kick Buddhism's ass. Like I'm going to be the best Buddhist I can be, and you're really driven to do that. Right. So you've got to sit with those two things, right?
I'm trying really hard to remember that I'm usually wrong if I think somebody is doing something that's against goodness. And I think we all are looking for value and looking to add value. So I'm trying to discover that in others. And that's been helping me work on my own projects too. Great.
Yeah, that's a key of the fundamental attribution error that we have. So if you want to learn more about cognitive biases and the way to make your brain work better, critical thinking and creativity, join us at the Human Intelligence Slack channel. Send me a request. I'll get you connected there. Thanks for being with us, Molly. I really appreciate your time. This is the best way to spend 30 minutes on a Monday morning. Thank you to everyone. Thank you. We'll see you next time.